Why, hello there. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Elder Scrolls Online and what is probably our most cursed run to date. But more on that later. The Elder Scrolls Online is an MMORPG developed by ZeniMax Studios and published by Bethesda Softworks, and was originally released 11 years ago in the spring of 2014 for both Windows and Mac, and then re-released a year later for both PlayStation and Xbox in the summer of 2015. The Elder Scrolls Online brings players back to the ever-familiar world of Nirn in its far-distant history, as this game is set in the Elder Scrolls universe 800 years before the events of both the Elder Scrolls III Morrowind as well as the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. The Elder Scrolls Online is set during the period of the Three Banners War, or as it's more commonly known as the Great War, where three warring factions fight for dominion in Cyrodiil in the hopes of occupying the now vacant Imperial throne in the hopes of ruling supreme over the rest. However, what the warring factions fail to realize is that when you're so busy looking forward, you often forget to watch your back. And so as their war rages on, and endless lives are lost in endless droves. Immortal entities who skulk in the dark have set their sights on Nirn, each with their own goals and schemes which ultimately converge in one simple goal, and that is making Nirn their own. And naturally, of course, armed with vast amounts of main character energy, it is up to you to stop them. We play as a soul shriven, a now soulless husk that was sacrificed to the Daedric prince Molag Bal, and it has now become our goal to stop the plane meld and retrieve our soul back from the Daedric prince of domination. And so what better way to not just celebrate Elder Scrolls Online turning 11 years old, but also the fact that they are finally implementing a subclassing feature which allows players to create their dream builds by being able to switch out their skill lines for that of other class lines, in the goal of truly making your character your own and playing how you want to play. And so, having our interest piqued by such a feature, we thought it would be fun to delve back into the world of ESO and take on a bit of a challenge while we were there. So today, we ask a question that no right-minded individual has asked before, and that is, can you beat Elder Scrolls Online using only unarmed damage? Now, before we get into the rules for this challenge, let's have a little talk about what we mean by beating the game. Because even though ESO does have fantastic solo potential, it is still a MMO by design, and as such, there is no true end to the game at the current moment, and depending on who you ask. The definition of endgame is very subjective depending on who you ask. So when we say we have to beat the game, we mean we must reach level 50 and have a fully functioning unarmed build at the end of it, as well as having completed the base game campaign missions where we stop the plane meld. But of course, a challenge run needs rules, so here are the two simple rules for this run. First off, we can only use unarmed attacks as our main weapon type until we reach level 50, then at that point we can add whatever we feel we need in order to complete our main goal of having a functioning build, and given the fact that there is no unarmed weapon class currently in the game, means we will really need to get creative with the build if we're going to stand a chance when we get to the champion levels. But that's a problem for past future bigs to deal with, so let's move on to our second goal of the challenge, and that is that we must complete the entirety of the Worm Cult story arc in the base game's main story in order to call this run a success. And so with our challenge set and our excitement on the rise, it is time for us to meet the hero or heroine of today's tale. So, as we arrive at the character creation screen, we are immediately met with the most important decisions regarding this challenge thus far, and that our friends is our characters, race and class. Now, you're probably wondering to yourself, but why is that so important? Can't every race do every in-game role without issue? Well, yes, technically that is true and is pretty much a given when crafting a normal build. But in this particular case, that doesn't really apply as we need all the stats that we can possibly muster up during this run. Because as we mentioned in the intro segment, using only unarmed damage means, well, we're not using a weapon, and with no unarmed weapon to make up for it, means we lose a rather hefty amount of weapon and spell damage that we would normally have if we were making a normal build. And as you surely guessed by now, this heavy loss in weapon and spell damage doesn't just affect our damaging and support-focused spells, but also the amount of damage we deal with our fists, which is less than ideal if we're being honest. But hey, it's all a part of the fun. And even though things are looking iffy from the get-go, all is not lost. You see, choosing an appropriate race that has innate weapon and spell damage as a part of their racial skill line can help offset that initial loss at least to a certain degree, which makes choosing the right race imperative to the success of this build, and thankfully our choices aren't daunting as we actually have only 3 real options for this run, and those are the High Elf, the Dark Elf, and our personal favorite, the Orc. The High Elf is typically your go-to for caster builds as they not only have a solid boost to their magicka, but can also boost their magicka or stamina, depending on what resource is lowest, whenever they activate an ability, and with a nice 258 weapon and spell damage, they can make a pretty solid choice for this type of build, especially if you want to weave in a few spells in between punches. Now, the Dark Elf is a somewhat unremarkable choice for this particular build, as they are used primarily for hybrid builds that utilize both magicka and stamina-based abilities. And unlike their High Elf cousins who can restore resources when they activate an ability, Dark Elves only get a maximum boost to their magicka and stamina pools, which isn't bad. But for this build, it's not that great. They also have a higher resistance to fire damage, which is nice, we guess, if you want to live out your Twilight fantasies and become a vampire for some reason. And finally, much like their High Elf cousins, the Dark Elves, share the same 258 weapon and spell damage boost as their High Elf cousins. But unfortunately, even with that, the Dark Elf is still the lesser of the 3 picks, which is kind of disappointing as we have always been a fan of the Dark Elves' looks. But regardless, we have our final choice in the 3 races, and that is the Orc. And buckle up, ladies and gentlemen, because the Orc is the undisputed fisting champion.
What? Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And the mandatory pick in regards to this challenge, because not only do orcs get a stamina bonus, which is handy for getting around the map, but they also get an increase to their maximum health, which for a build that's going to be in the thick of it for much longer than a normal build typically is very handy indeed. However, that's not all the Orc has to offer. You see, on top of the extra health we gain, we also gain access to a passive heal that restores 2,130 points of our health every 4 seconds, making us quite the sturdy frontliner on the battlefield. And if that wasn't enough, there's still more you see on top of sharing the same weapon and spell damage passives like the High Elf and the Dark Elves. Orcs also gain a reduced sprint cost and increased sprint distance, making it that much easier to travel between enemies, and it was these reasons alone that made us choose an Orc for this run. But just choosing a race isn't enough, because if we were going to make this build work, we had to pick the right class for the job, and it was here where we made the biggest mistake of this run, and that was choosing the Templar class. And why is that an issue exactly? Well, simply because we're a 900 IQ genius that forgot the Infinite Archive existed, and that it had armor set that would have been absolutely perfect for this run. And while that may sound like good news, it is not, as the Pyrebrand set is exclusively locked behind the Dragon Knight class, meaning only Dragon Knights can farm it and equip it, and in case that wasn't a big enough L to take, the worst was yet to come. As later we found out that, had we just chosen the Dragon Knight class, we would have had much more damage compared to the Templar class in the long run. But hey, you live and learn, right? Right? Guys? And so, with that monumental L under our belt, we finished creating our ruggedly handsome orc for the run, and after giving him the rather fitting name of Brutus the Ironfist, we are then sent to the tutorial segment of Coldharbour called the Wailing Prison, and after loading in and tweaking our in-game settings for a better combat experience and also applying some of our age-old cosmetics to further enhance Brutus's look, we then meet the projection of a man known simply as the Prophet, or, as we will be dubbing him throughout this run, Mr. Spooks, who then tells us that our only hope of escape lies with finding and partnering up with a Nordic woman named Lyris the Titanborn, who will then help us escape Coldharbour and help us return safely to our home on Nirn. And so, after talking with Mr. Spooks and realizing we have no feasible way of finding this woman Lyris, we make our way to our cell door ready to bust it open with our orcish strength, and as Brutus gathers his strength and prepares to bust open the door anime style, Lyris, the woman we were tasked to find by Mr. Spooks, conveniently comes running past our cell door and then proceeds to smash it open with her battle axe. Funny how things work out, right? Regardless, disappointed that we can't style on an inanimate object, we leave our cell and then have Lyris immediately disrespect the spirit of the run by offering us a random weapon off a nearby corpse. Thankfully, unlike most games that would force you to equip it in order to progress, we thankfully don't have to do that in this game, meaning the run lives on. And so, after kindly turning down her offer and showing her the only pair of weapons we need for this run are in the form of our enormous meat hunks, we progress together throughout the tutorial level of the game, learning all of the intricate mechanics along the way, such as light and heavy attacks, blocking, interruptions, and also capitalizing on off-balance enemies. And with each segment, we are ultimately led closer and closer to our first sub-boss of the run, and he's dead. Okay, moving on then. With that rather uneventful encounter out of the way, we progress to level 2, and it is here where we will touch on our leveling format for the run while Brutus is running through the tutorial, doing his own thing. So in the Elder Scrolls Online, every time you level up, you are awarded between 1 to 3 skill attribute points and the corresponding amount of skill points depending on what level you are. Now, skill points are very self-explanatory. You use these points to unlock, morph, and buy passives in your corresponding skill trees. And unlike attribute points, skill points are actually farmable in-game by either leveling up, finding sky shards out in the world, completing public dungeons, questline rewards, main story rewards, and also as a one-time reward from completing a special quest associated with the many in-game dungeons available in-game. However, attribute points are a completely different beast because they are only awarded when you level up, much like skill points. But unlike skill points, attribute points are not farmable in-game, meaning once you reach level 50, you are awarded 64 points, and then that's it. That's your lot. However, much like the previous Elder Scrolls games, these attribute points can be distributed between the 3 main stats of health, stamina, and magicka. Now, if you'll allow us to put our old man glasses on for a moment and reminisce, back in the long-lost days of yesteryear, attribute points worked very differently to how they do today. Because back then, you needed to distribute these points according to your build in order to boost a particular skill type. So, for example, if we take a look at stamina, stamina was used primarily for weapon damage skills. These included the two-handed, dual-wield sword and board skill lines, as well as any stamina-based skill in either your weapon trees or your class skill lines. While magicka is the complete reverse of stamina and was used to boost magic skills, we know, shocker, right? Anywho, these magicka skills were limited primarily to both the destruction and restoration staff skill lines, as well as any magicka-based skill in your class lines, making them less impactful than stamina skills were. But thankfully, that's no longer the case, because these days, thanks to a rather player-friendly change made by the developers, this is no longer the case. Because now having 64 points in either magicka or stamina will enhance the damage and utility of any skill. regardless of whether it is a physical or magic skill, in what the devs called hybridization, which had the sole goal of allowing players to experience more build diversity when building their characters. Meaning no matter what stat you invest in nowadays, whether it be magicka or stamina, you'll gain the increased effectiveness to both skill types, allowing whatever build you're crafting to become a bit more fleshed out and operate at peak efficiency. And to this end, we will be investing in our stamina for the time being. However, as we progress a bit higher in the level department, we will be reallocating our points from stamina to magicka so that we can reliably balance our support and healing spells without running into magicka issues. So, having covered skill points, leveling in general, and Brutus having put the smackdown on the bony boys, Mr. Spooks introduces us to Sky Shards, and using its power opens a portal back to Nirn, freeing both ourselves as well as a handful of trapped souls along with us. And it is here where the real grind of this challenge begins. As we awake on our faction's tutorial island, we talk to Mr. Spooks and turn in our quest, awarding us both the Soul Magic skill line as well as 2 skill points, which will come in very handy further down the line. But before we get to questing, we pay a visit to the champion screen and begin investing points in some pretty handy passive skills that will help us out during our adventures, and after slotting in our champion nodes, we teleport to our guild hall in order to craft and pick up the beginning gear and boosts in order to start the build off. And these come in the form of the Thief Mundus Stone, which increases our base critical chance, and also our beginning armor of the run by having Brutus craft himself a full set of light, medium, and heavy armor. Because unlike, say, Skyrim or Oblivion, where you could wear iron gauntlets and level up heavy armor while strutting around in your birthday suit, in the Elder Scrolls Online, achieving the same effect is a bit more involved. You see, you need to have 3 pieces of certain armor weight equipped in order to unlock the corresponding skill lines for that weight. However, in order to level it up, you only need to equip 1 piece on your person at any given time. But the more pieces of a particular armor weight you're wearing at a given time, the faster that particular skill line will level up. And a vast majority of players tend to favor the armor ratio of 5-1-1 for their endgame builds, meaning they would wear 5 pieces of their main armor weight while wearing a singular piece of the other 2 weights, as not only do you get little boosts from each of the individual armor trees themselves, but in the Undaunted skill line, there's a passive skill that grants a 2% increase to health, magicka, and stamina for every weight of armor you're wearing, which may not sound like much, but getting a 6% boost to health, stamina, and magicka in the endgame is incredibly nice to have, especially for more spammy builds. And in Brutus's case, we will be going for the ratio of 5 medium, 1 heavy chest plate, and 1 light belt. And the reason why we chose medium armor is simply because it is the only one out of the 3 armor weights that grants both critical damage and the rather coveted stat for this build weapon and spell damage, which we are in dire need of for this build. And so, having acquired all our beginner buffs as well as our starting armor of the run, we decide not to return to our Alliance's tutorial island, but instead travel to Auridon in the Aldmeri Dominion, and it is here where our grind to level 50 begins. Because at the time of recording this run, the Jubilee event that marks the Elder Scrolls Online Anniversary season was in full swing, meaning that we gained an extra 100% bonus experience from all sources, which was stackable with independent experience scrolls. And in Auridon, almost all the world events and quests are relatively close to one another, plus it is one of our favorite areas in the game, so there's also that too. Regardless, we ventured forth throughout Auridon, slowly discovering and unraveling the plots of the Veiled Heritants, who are the big bads of the Auridon region. And it is here where we also meet a few new friends along Brutus's journey in the form of everybody's favorite Khajiit, Razumdar, and even get to join Queen Erin as a member of the Eyes of the Queen who act as spies for the Aldmeri Crown. And slowly but surely, with every event and every quest, Brutus slowly became more and more powerful, eventually reaching level 10. And it is here where brand new systems open up to us in the form of the Dungeon Finder, which awards huge amounts of experience once per day, which is essential for power leveling new characters. However, that is not what is most beneficial to us at the moment, because what we're interested in at the moment is Cyrodiil, aka PvP. Now, here's a fun fact about us. We don't enjoy PvP in video games.
What didn't you like about it?
It insists upon itself, Lois.
What?
It insists upon itself.
What does that even mean?
In fact, the last game with PvP that we actually enjoyed was way back when in the Dark Souls 2 days, where people used to do fight clubs on the Iron Keep Bridge with some of the most gimmicky and fun builds we've ever seen. Ah, such good memories. Where were we? Oh, right. Ever since then, the thought of delving into PvP in other games with a bunch of tryhards and sweats with meta builds duking it out in various arenas has never appealed to us since those days. Which probably leaves you with the question, Biggs, why are you looking forward to PvP if you don't like playing it? And is a very good question, and normally we wouldn't be. However, we would be remiss if we didn't address the fact that PvP can be incredibly lucrative for PvE players in the Elder Scrolls Online, and for the most part doesn't actually involve you fighting other players, unless you're unlucky enough to come across some bloodthirsty PvP veteran who kills anything and everything on sight, which depending on what time you're playing is very rare but not improbable. And the reason we are excited for unlocking PvP is simply because completing the first few missions of the Cyrodiil questline will not only unlock our assault and support skill lines, which gives us access to more mount speed for the simple price of a singular skill point, as well as access to a relatively solid stamina-based healing ability in the form of Vigor, but we also gain a few more skill points that we can use to unlock the passive effects in our skill lines for the price of just doing what is essentially 3 to 4 glorified fetch quests, which take about 5 minutes each to complete, and if that wasn't enough, we gain access to a special farm which will be vital to finishing this build later on. So yeah, as you can see, PvP is very lucrative. And even if you're not making a PvP build, it is still worth doing the bare minimum just to unlock all this stuff. And so, after paying a visit to the war-torn nation of Cyrodiil to unlock our PvP lines, we returned to Auridon, where we continued to slowly progress through the zone while always making sure to have the Dungeon Finder on so that we can earn even more bursts of experience in between our general questing, and sure enough, battle after battle and fight after fight, we slowly made our way through each zone quest and took on every new random dungeon that we got taken to, gradually causing our character level to rise more and more, until eventually, after multiple days of making our way through Auridon and various dungeons, we finally managed to hit character level 50. Now, at this point in the run, we would like to say that we were done with Brutus's build, but unfortunately that's far from the case, because now we had to grind not just 1 but 2 world-class lines, and as we edit this portion of the run, we are reunited with a pain in our soul. And why is that, you're probably wondering? Well, dear viewer, that is because one of these skill lines didn't even make it into the final version of the build, making the endeavor a futile effort. But regardless, we're losing our train of thought. The world lines that we now had to level came in the form of the Psijic Order, which is unique to the Somerset DLC, and the base game skill line of the Fighters Guild. However, that's not all, as we also have to dive heads first into the scribing system, which was added during the Blackwood DLC, which in order to actually make spells involves us to farm various scripts, which can only be reliably gotten 3 times a day, and these scripts are what are used in order to make our chosen spells. However, for the sake of pacing, we'll touch more on the scribing system and the Fighters Guild skill line a bit later on in the run. For the time being, we set our sights on the beautiful land of Somerset, home of the High Elves and also the location of the ever-elusive Psijic Order. Now, for those among you who have never played the Elder Scrolls Online before or have never leveled the Psijic Order skill line before, consider yourself lucky, as this skill line is pretty up there as one of the most boring skill lines to level in the game, alongside the Mages Guild skill line. But what makes it so boring? You see, a vast majority of quests for the Psijic Order revolve around sealing time breaches, which, while it sounds cool, it is not, as a majority of these quests are just one humongous game of hide-and-seek disguised as a plot device because at least 7 of the 10 mandatory quests to maxing out the Psijic Order skill line involve you to go to a particular faction area, finding 7 to 8 different portals scattered around the map, all the while using a paper map that was as useful as a tissue in a rainstorm, and at times expected it to turn around and ask us for the directions to these rifts. Like seriously, if it wasn't for the Augur of the Obscure, a sentient talking skull with the wisdom of the universe keeping you company and offering little sarcastic quips throughout your journey, we don't think we could have finished leveling this skill line, but through perseverance and many hours spanned over a few days, we finally managed to max out the Psijic Order skill line, granting us access to what should have been an amazing power-up for the build in the form of the morphed version of Imbue Weapon, called Crushing Weapon, a skill that infuses your next attack within 2 seconds. Yes, you heard that right, 2 seconds. With an additional 2,160 points of damage, as well as applying Major Breach, which reduces enemy armor by 5,948 points, which sounds pretty good on paper, and for a while this skill was looking like a definite mainstay. In the final version of the build, whether that was out of delirium or just not wanting to admit we wasted time leveling this particular skill line. However, reality soon took hold and we realized that, sadly, a vast amount of things held this skill back, those being that it only lasts 2 seconds, the fact that it has a cast time which really interrupts the flow of combat to the point that it's downright clunky to use, and finally the fact that the Major Breach that it applies only lasts for 5 seconds. With no way of extending it. And so with a heavy heart and tired eyes, we moved on to leveling up the last world-class line that we would need for this run before we tackled the main story. And that was the Fighters Guild skill line. So, unlike the Psijic Order skill line, the Fighters Guild skill line offers 4 different ways for players to level it up. Those are by completing individual missions in the Fighters Guild quest line, completing Fighters Guild daily missions, killing Daedra out in the world, and finally completing the dolmens scattered around the various base game zones. And while the thought of mind-numbingly farming Daedra in the open world for countless hours sounds divine, we decided we wanted to finish this run at some point this year. Which is why we decided to utilize a beloved old-school farm that's still favored by the player base to this day, and that is farming dolmens. However, this isn't your standard dolmen farm, where you travel for 5 minutes to each of the zone's dolmens in the hopes of securing some of the experience and loot. No. This farm takes part in the unforgiving home of the Red Guards in the Alakar Desert, and as such is widely referred to by the community as the Alakar Loop. But what makes the Alakar Loop so beloved by the player base? Well, that, dear viewer, is a good question, and the reason that the Alakar Loop is so favored by players is for various reasons. Number 1, it is the most easiest and simple way to farm experience currently in the game, often turning fresh new characters into level 50 champions within a matter of just a few hours. Number 2, it is a reliable way to level up your jewelry skill line and gather jewelry-related materials, and each completed dolmen will award 1 to 2 pieces of jewelry which can then be either deconstructed or researched at a jeweler's workstation in order to learn corresponding traits. Number 3, it awards over 70 points of Fighters Guild experience for each dolmen completed, which depending on the amount of people taking part usually takes about a minute or 2 to complete. And finally, it is a good source for unlocking gear for your sticker book, as well as a source of easy achievements that characters can use to unlock various armor dyes and titles. And it is for these reasons alone that the Alakar Loop is considered an incredible one-stop shop for getting your new or low-level characters off the ground and ready to farm the higher-level content. So, we ventured forth to the Alakar Desert, however we didn't go with the sole reason of just leveling our Fighters Guild skill line, because now that we were champion level 50, we decided to add a much-needed boost to the build, and that our friends came in the form of a back bar destruction staff. However, because we haven't touched a destruction staff up to this point, we now needed to level up the skill line, so after finding a random staff in our bag and equipping it, we jumped on the Alakar Loop, and thankfully, Because of all the questing and dungeons we did beforehand, we were already at Fighters Guild level 5, meaning we only had just 5 levels to max out the skill line. And so, after numerous hours spread out over a few days, we finally did it. Not only did we manage to max out our Fighters Guild skill line, but we also managed to max out our Destruction Staff skill line in the process. But was it worth the effort? Yes. Yes, it was. You see, the Fighters Guild skill line offers this type of build so much in the way of power. These various spikes come in the form of the Slayer and banish the wicked passive skills which grant us weapon and spell damage as well as ultimate respectively, for just having a Fighters Guild ability equipped. But we also gain access to a heavy bleed damage over time skill and the minor force buff, which increases our critical damage by 10% through the use of the Trap Beast and Barbed Trap skills. But we also gain our major savagery and prophecy buff, which boosts our critical rate through the use of the expert hunter and camouflaged hunter skills. And if that wasn't enough, we also gain access to a rather powerful ultimate ability for this build in the form of Flawless Dawnbreaker, which further increases our weapon and spell damage by a chunky 300 points when activated. And it is thanks to all these boosts and bonuses that makes the Fighters Guild skill line the most valuable skill line in the game for this particular challenge. But we're not done yet, because now that we have maxed out our Fighters Guild skill line, it was time to begin putting the finishing touches on the build, which means it was time to tackle the final grind of the challenge in the form of the scribing script grind, and it was here where the PvP that we unlocked earlier really shined through and proved just how lucrative it could be. And by now, you've probably been wondering what this mysterious PvP grind is. Well, ladies and gentlemen, allow us to present to you the best PvP daily mission in the form of the Elven Garden District daily mission located in the Imperial City. But what makes this daily mission so good? Well, you see, on top of being a rather low-effort mission compared to the other daily missions located in the Imperial City, this particular mission doesn't require you to fight other players. Instead, all you need to do is burn down 4 enemy ballistas, grab a barrel of oil and blow up the enemy's forge, which is simplicity itself, and by turning this quest in you are guaranteed a focus script for scribing that you don't have, and by combining this daily mission alongside the Mages Guild daily mission and the daily dungeons, we can secure ourselves 3 unique scripts per day, and it is thanks to these scripts that we managed to kit Brutus out with a few rather handy skills. Those being in the form of the rather amazing Banner Bearer skill, which at the point of recording this run was a free permanent buff to your character. However, that has since been changed so that it costs a little bit of stamina and magicka every 2 seconds. But alongside the Banner Bearer skill, we also scribed the Ulfsild's Contingency skill, which upon activation allows us to ready an area of effect damage over time that activates after taking any action, which adds much needed power and utility to the final version of the build. And so, after finally farming skill lines and scripts for customized skills, it was time to put the crowning touch on the build. Which meant that, finally, after all this time in the challenge, it was time to kit Brutus out with his endgame armor of the run, which will surprise you as it combines a widely used set with a criminally underused armor set and mythic item. So, after going through our sticker book and even going as far as theory crafting and testing different loadouts on the private test server on PC, all the while incorporating what we've learned throughout this challenge up to this point, and that was primarily the fact that unarmed heavy attacks are just too slow and unreliable to build into to an effective degree. Meaning, in order to get the most damage out of this build, we would have to max out the damage of our much faster light attacks, which was definitely the way to go for a build like this. And so, after many hours of testing on the private test server experimenting with different sets, we eventually decided to settle on a combination of the 5-piece Blood Moon set from the March of Sacrifices dungeon for our main body pieces, not only because it was a medium armor set so it gave us weapon and spell damage as a passive, but also for the 2 lines of critical chance and the rather busted 5-piece passive that works perfectly for this build, and that is, when we deal damage with a melee light attack, aka our punches, we gain a stack of a unique buff called Blood Scent, and when we gain 5 stacks of Blood Scent, We then enter a frenzied state for 5 seconds, and during this time, our melee light attack damage will increase by 2,050 points, and our attack speed will be increased by a rather juicy 50%, making our already quick punches even quicker, which in turn means even more damage for us. And in keeping in theme with the light attack build that we're creating, we combine the 5-piece Blood Moon with the 5-piece Noble Duelist set from the Blessed Crucible dungeon, which when we deal damage with a light or heavy attack on our back bar while in melee range of the enemy, we increase the damage that our light and heavy attacks deal against monsters by 2,110, which for this type of build is quite the considerable boost to our damage output. And finally, we paired both of these sets with the rather underutilized mythic item Belharza's Band, which further increases the damage of our light attacks by a further 900 points. And when we deal damage with consecutive melee light attacks, we then gain a stack of Belharza's Temper upon every consecutive melee light attack up to a maximum of 5 stacks. And at 5 stacks, we then consume all stacks of Belharza's Temper, and after 1 second, deal 1,471 physical damage to enemies in a line in front of us, and on top of that, even stuns them for 3 seconds. Which not only offers some much-needed area of effect damage, but also some crowd control, and the ability to actually, hit our enemy, which is always a good thing. However, it was at this point in the run that things started getting kinda weird. Remember when we said this was our most cursed run to date in the introduction? Well, after kitting out Brutus with his shiny new gear and playing around with the completed version of the build, we began to notice, during this point in the run, a variety of in-game weirdness starting to happen. And at first, it was just funny and mildly infuriating bugs, such as in-game models glitching out and duplicating. The game auto-switching our ability bar after a load screen, which got more frustrating the longer the challenge went on. However, these bugs gradually got more and more impactful as time went on. The most impactful of which being the enemy hitboxes, which for some reason was failing to register any and all incoming single-target attacks, which is a vast majority of our kit, by the way, and against basic trash mobs, it wasn't an overly huge deal. However, when it happened against bosses, that's when it went from being not a huge deal to becoming a very huge deal indeed. And this wasn't even the worst bug that we experienced during this run, but that's something we'll talk about a bit later in the run. Speaking of which, now that we have Brutus fully kitted out, we head back to our Alliance's capital city of Mournhold in the Ebonheart Pact, where we meet up with Mr. Spooks, who then invites us into a little hidey hole out in the wilderness called the Harborage. And it is from this little hidey hole where our voyage into the main campaign begins, which starts off with us traveling through Mr. Spook's memories and witnessing the folly of the 5 companions whose misguided actions set the plane meld in motion. Well, with a little backstabbing from the world's #1 necromantic douchebag Mannimarco, that is. And so, as we return to the Harborage ready to take Mannimarco down a peg, Mr. Spooks tells us that we will need more allies standing beside us if we hope to stand a chance against Mannimarco. Clearly someone hasn't been paying attention to the run so far. But anyway, narrative restrictions aside and guided by Mr. Spooks, we set out in order to recruit more allies to our cause. And these companions come in the form of the wannabe run killer Lyrus, and the ever-stuck-up Abner Tharn, who's only here because he tricked us into saving him by claiming he knows information that can help us.
So that was a fucking lie.
And if that betrayal wasn't enough, Mr. Spooks reveals to us that he is indeed the fallen emperor who set the plane meld in motion due to his hubris. And so with those betrayals aside, we begrudgingly set back out with Mr. Spooks and our newfound companions in order to recruit the last member of our little ragtag group of misfits, a Redguard swordmaster called Sai Sahan, who before his capture at the hands of Mannimarco had hidden the Amulet of Kings in a remote location, and in classic storytelling fashion, we need to find the Amulet of Kings before we stand any hope of putting the smackdown on Mannimarco. And so, after liberating Sai Sahan from Mannimarco's clutches, we learned that he entrusted the Amulet of Kings to an old friend in a remote location of Hammerfell called the Valley of Blades, which was surely a good idea, right? Welp. We wouldn't know because as we saved Sai and traveled back to the Harborage to finish this mission, we were plagued by various disconnects and in-game crashes. It's almost like the game is trying to tell us something at this point. Anyway, So after numerous attempts, we finally managed to progress and reach the Valley of Blades. And surprise, surprise, it's under attack. God, we really suck at this whole hero thing. So after pushing back the enemy forces and putting the smack down on a Titan, we finally learned where Sai, in all of his infinite wisdom, decided to hide the Amulet of Kings. And where did he decide to hide such a precious artifact from the most powerful necromancer in all of Tamriel? Why? In a crypt, of course. You know, the last place on Earth that a necromancer would think to look. God damn it, Sai. Anyway, as we reach the interior of Sancre Tor, it is revealed to us that Mannimarco has been tracking our movements using an unwitting Sai Sahan as the catalyst. And so after fighting our way through undead and spending longer than we would care to admit on this bridge puzzle, we finally have our final showdown with Mannimarco, who this entire time has been seeking the Amulet of Kings so that he could use its power to betray and replace the Daedric prince Molag Bal, who after our battle with Mannimarco reveals that he knew of Mannimarco's impending betrayal the entire time and drags his soul into Cold Harbor, and in the process ridding Tamriel of one more necromancer. You love to see it. And so, with the Amulet of Kings in hand, we have one last thing to do before we can put an end to this run. But first, we decide to revel in a quest well done by joining Lyris in a pint of mead, where she proceeds to lay down the sickest burn in the history of Tamriel.
To Molag Bal, that ugly skeever. May his privates be infected with brown rot fever. May our course be true and our hearts be brave, as we march into Cold Harbor to spit on his grave.
And so, after a teaser of Lyris's new album and a pint of mead, we get back to work, which involves us leading an assault on Cold Harbor itself before Brutus can put the smackdown on Molag Bal. So after negotiating with the Alliance leaders, which went as well as putting a bull in a china shop, we finally managed to convince the Alliance leaders to send both the mages and fighters guilds into Cold Harbor in their stead. However, in typical fashion, this is where things hit the fan, because as we arrive in Cold Harbor, we discover that due to a mishap with the portal, the entirety of the fighter and mages guilds that accompanied us now lie scattered and lost across Cold Harbor. However, it's not all bad news, as, with the help of the best companion Cadwell, we discover a safe haven in the form of the Hollow City. And so, with a new base of operations to work from and Brutus being the hero that he is, we then proceed to comb the hellish landscape of Cold Harbor in order to bring the various members of the Fighters and Mages guilds home, and along the way even manage to form new allegiances and friendships along the way, increasing our chance of survival quite drastically. Which means finally, after many weeks of crafting, questing, leveling, and farming, it was finally time. Time to put an end to this challenge, and with the fantastic Sir Cadwell at our side during the final siege, we finally confront Molag Bal. However, in a beneficial twist of fate, it turns out we're not fighting Molag Bal alone, and that he isn't the only Daedric prince in this realm. You see, when we discovered the Hollow City thanks to Cadwell, we met a mysterious figure who simply went by the name of the Groundskeeper, who at the time just gave us some background lore on the Hollow City and how it was a city once protected by the Daedric prince Meridia. Well, turns out the Groundskeeper was in fact Meridia herself. And with the help of a Daedric prince of our own, Meridia uses her powers to help us end the plane meld and restore a semblance of peace to Tamriel. And so, with the plane meld now and truly ended, it is time for Brutus to settle one last score, and that involves him going head-to-head with the Prince of Domination. So after getting a message from Mr. Spooks and feeling slightly bitter that our companions didn't even bother come to Cold Harbor in order to lend us a hand, we head back to the harborage one last time and travel into the heart of Cold Harbor, where we step forward into the final fight of the challenge. However, as we reach Molag Bal's throne, Abnor Tharn tells us that in order to gain the power of the Amulet of Kings, which we need in order to fight Molag Bal on equal terms, we must first sacrifice the life of one of our companions. And after a heartfelt plea from Mr. Spooks, who volunteers for the task in order to make amends for his part in unleashing this evil upon Tamriel, We are then infused with divine power, which not only gives us the power needed for the battle ahead, but also a very swanky set of armor as a result. You love to see it. And after so long, it is finally time. Time for Brutus to put the smack down on a Daedric prince, reclaim his soul, and save the world. Now, as we stand here on the precipice of the final battle, the crowning glory of the run and the culmination of all our time invested into the challenge, we run into an issue. Do you remember earlier when we were talking about the various bugs and glitches that we experienced during the run, and that we would talk about the worst bug that we encountered during the challenge later on in the video? Well, ladies and gentlemen, here it is. We're not sure what happened, but for some reason, Molag Bal just did not want to fight Brutus. We're not sure whether he went to get a coffee or what, but he was an absolute no-show after that last attack, and after about 5 minutes of running around the arena trying to get him to spawn, and thinking that this was the end of the run, he finally gets the memo as out of nowhere. He replays the entire sequence all over again, only this time he actually spawns in the arena below this time. And so, after one last decisive battle and laying the smackdown on Molag Bal, and Brutus throwing all our hard work during the challenge out of the window for the sake of style points, we managed to not only free our soul, but the countless souls that were stolen by the Daedric Prince of Domination. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, the run comes to an end. So, can you beat the Elder Scrolls Online with only fists? Yes, you can. This run was actually really fun as it demanded a very different approach compared to how we would normally kit out our characters, both in terms of the skills used, as well as the choice of armor sets that we had to choose from for maximum damage potential. And to our surprise, an unarmed build is surprisingly effective, especially past level 50. And we can imagine that with the introduction of subclassing, which at the time of writing this outro has been live for about 2 weeks on console, that meme builds such as this will be able to perform quite well and be very solid off meta pick for both the hipsters and the fun seekers looking for a little spice in their character roster. And hey, if you manage to make it to the end of the run, leave a comment with hashtag Ironfist so that we know who you are. And until next time, ladies and gentlemen, remember to take care, stay safe, and we'll see you all in the next challenge.